Hello everyone, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming for this Plenty TP workshop. So this is a workshop in the context of our General Assembly, and the aim of this is to update our strategic research and innovation agenda. And so we will be looking towards the future, trying to see, trying to discuss what is our vision of European farming in the future. And so for this we've invited a few really good speakers to provide their kind of inspiration and their views on the current situation, on the challenges, and on what they see for the future to help inspire us. So our first speaker is Tassos Haniotis here. So he used to work at DG AGRI in strategy, and really he retired last year, and we've had him before actually in our General Assembly a few years ago. So we're very happy to have him here again and share his expertise and his really deep knowledge. So without further ado, I hand it off to Tassos.
Thank you very much, Amrit, and thanks also for giving me the opportunity to remind myself and people that could retire and still be active. I retired from the European Commission. And in the absence of a business card, I have to use something, so that's why you see the former director, that's what I am still. I should put ag economist there because it's getting to be an endangered species, but I'm an ag economist by training. And what you're going to see here are some personal thoughts that are still in the form of development, if you want, about where we're going. And then I will let you, of course, derive your own conclusions with all the opinions you get from other experts about the accuracy of some of the things I'm going to say. Nothing is in a crystal ball. But as you see there, you don't only see that the views expressed are strictly personal. That's self-evident, but at least it's good to remind people. But also in LinkedIn, I've put a couple of things recently, and there is going to be a series of other articles that I want to keep doing that will develop a little bit some of the thoughts that I have now. And what I try to put in the title is, I put it with a question mark, whether this time is different in the manner by which we see what is happening in agricultural markets, and especially the debate it has generated on food security concerns. And I will start with a slide that I have to admit that I was surprised when I saw it, because I have been using on various occasions a different slide that has the evolution of agricultural prices compared with the prices of energy, metals and minerals, and fertilizers. But then there has been so much food inflation, and that you see whether you go to the supermarket, and now that I'm retired I go more often to the supermarket, whether you go to the restaurants and you see that there has been clearly an adjustment in all the bills that we pay. And what I thought of doing is actually compare the food consumer price index of the FAO, that goes unfortunately back only to 2000, and that's the orange line, with the food price index of the World Bank. Now the food price index of the World Bank is essentially pretty similar to the agricultural producer price index of FAO. It is the agricultural price index of the World Bank minus tobacco, cotton and rubber. So it is actually the food elements, but at the producer level. And what you see in the green line is clearly the three agricultural price booms and busts we have had in the last 20 years. There was another one in the middle 90s, but I couldn't find the corresponding data on the consumer price, so I didn't go to that. And what you see is what we have expected. Prices went up and then went down. As I learned in the States in the years that passed there, Americans like to say that high prices is the best cure for high prices. And that applies, it seems, at the producer level. Why doesn't it apply at the consumer level? We started first to discuss this in the previous boom and bust of the financial crisis. 5 years we spent, the time that I was still in the Commission, we were coordinating that, this food chain forum that we had. We're still struggling to figure out what happened then, but at least what you could see with this orange line is that the previous significant spikes in agricultural producers' prices did not generate food price inflation. And what you see clearly here is in the last couple of years we had a very significant acceleration in the food price index, the one that consumers pay. I don't have a clear answer for that, and it's one of the things that with my friend John Buffett at the World Bank, we want to work a little bit with some econometrics to see whether we can figure anything out or not. I have a gut feeling, and my gut feeling is that in the aftermath of the asymmetric recovery from COVID, and in the parallel jump that energy prices had before the Russian invasion, because we had geostrategic tensions even before and after the invasion especially, my feeling is that there is a part of the food chain that has used all this as an excuse to increase prices at levels that are not justified by what is happening at the basic level of producer prices. I repeat, this is a gut feeling. But I find it very strange, and you can see that if you look at the next slide, that if you look at these periods of agricultural price booms and busts, what you have in green here is the agricultural prices. On the left side, in filled bars, if you want, is when prices were going up, and you have the duration that went up for 21 consecutive months in 2006 and 8, only for 8 months in 10-11, and for 24 months, 2 years now. And what you have in the more dotted lines below is what happens when prices went down. And you see that every time that agricultural producer prices went up, they dropped. They only dropped slightly now because we only have 6 months period. It's still continuing. Generally, nothing seemed to move much in the food price inflation in the past compared to what happened here, and prices are not going down. And what you also see is a very significant jumps in the energy prices, which is the red line. The blue is the food inflation. And of course, if I were to include more recent prices on energy, they would go further down, but the data was not available to allow a comparison between producer and consumer prices because FAO is a bit behind in terms of the consumer food price index. Now, what does this mean? It means that in two basic human needs, on food and on energy, what we used to have, whether you call it the Engel law, we used to call it in economics when it comes to food, the fact that we had a very long downward trend in the share of our expenditure that went to food and also to energy for a significant point of time. This might be coming at least to a temporary end. In fact, it's going the other way around. And this has major policy implications in terms of the debates about the green transition, because it indicates that the cost of this transition will be higher than what we expected. Does this mean that we should stop this transition? I'm not claiming this. In fact, what you will see at the end is that for me, one of the worst things that happened in the last 2 years is this totally false debate between do we have to go for climate action or for food security. I have always claimed that we have to go for both. And there are ways to go for both, especially if we focus more on a couple of things that I want at the end. But for the moment, we do have a challenge that we need to address. So let's look at the food security aspects right now, because these are the ones that are the new in terms of the debate we have had. And let's look at one of the biggest drivers of food demand, which is population growth. The selection of countries here is linked to the focus I had on wheat, which is my last piece in LinkedIn if you want to see it. If you were to focus on other products, I would add and subtract a couple of countries. Mexico, for example, plays a much more important role when it comes to meat. You could drop Russia and Ukraine in meat because they don't play a role. But my focus was wheat because I consider wheat to be, par excellence, the food security crop and product. And what you see here is, first of all, how small part of the world we are, the European Union. We have the tendency to think that we are the center of the universe. And what you see also is where the growth is. China has stopped growing. I think they're expected to grow by only 17 million people in the next 10 years, and this is nothing for a monster like China of almost 1.4 billion. India has dropped significantly its annual rate of growth on population, but still India will add 100 million people, despite a growth rate that is clearly below 1, something like 0.7%. Africa, on the other hand, will continue growing at above 2%. And what Africa does is it increases its population by 1 United States of America in the next 10 years. And the rest of Asia, if you take China and India out, increases, but at less than 1% still. It's a very big part of the world, and there are a lot of people out there. So the first conclusion I derive from this slide is forget about food security. We don't have a problem in the European Union because food security is a global problem as climate change is a global problem. We do have a very significant challenge on food security at global level. And if food doesn't go where people need it, people will go for food is available. It's as simple as this. A couple of slides that I will go very fast. This is the past wheat net trade changes between 1996 and 21. I adjusted what I had used before. Roughly speaking, EU and the US increased their net trade surplus by 7 million metric tons combined. 8 million metric tons were added by the old traditional exporters, Australia, Canada, and Argentina, Brazil, and the rest of Latin America. If you put them together, they increased the small deficit by 1 million metric ton, minus 5 million metric tons China and India, but very small deficits. The big changes have been plus 52 million metric tons, the surplus of Ukraine and Russia, minus 67 million metric tons, the deficit of Africa and the rest of Asia. So practically a very significant part of what the world was demanding in wheat was coming from Ukraine and Russia. Now, what about the future? I don't know about the future. I didn't use OECD FAO or the European Commission because these were done only last year. I used the most recent ones, which is what the Americans did only last month, because they incorporate more the impact of the war in Ukraine than anybody else has done. And what you see when you look into the future, look at the right-hand side, you see the very significant increases that are expected in Africa and the rest of Asia. This is 10 years. The previous graph was 25 years. So in the next 10 years, what the Americans expect is that we will have an increased deficit of 21 million metric tons in Africa and the rest of Asia, mainly in Africa. Where do they expect this to come from? What is very interesting is they have the EU, the US, and Canada significantly increasing their exports of wheat. I don't know where we're going to find land. Max will tell us what he's going to do with his yields afterwards, so that will solve this problem. What is also very interesting is that the Americans expect that Ukraine would lose more than half of what they export annually for the next 10 years. And if you look at the areas of production and the total destruction there, the mining will take some years, but even bringing people back to the places that are totally devastated will also take some time. So here we do have a real challenge, and of course with this graph at least, the winner comes out to be Russia, that would be feeding sub-Saharan Africa. So that's, if you want, a very strategic question that we have to ask ourselves as a European Union. Do we have a role to play in world markets or not? My answer is obviously yes. I'm not sure that everybody agrees with that, but I'm the one that is speaking right now, and with the freedom of a retiree. Now, very fast, the past maize net trend changes have mainly been driven by the growth, especially in Asia. Africa doesn't play that much role in maize. And the increases has been Argentina and Brazil for very low levels, and also Ukraine, exporting more than 25 million metric tons. What the Americans expect in the future, again, a very significant drop in what Ukraine is going to do. More exports coming from the US, because they have also stabilization in terms of biofuel. And a very significant increase also from Brazil, not much from Argentina. And the rest of Asia is actually the one that will be sucking this maize. Similar things happen when it comes to the soybean complex, pretty much stability in the European Union. This is not only soybeans, but soybean meal in soybean equivalent. The US and especially Brazil are increasing their exports, to some extent Argentina, and China mainly for its meat industry, and to some part the rest of Asia are actually importing. So what you see here is a very significant difference with what you saw before with respect to Africa. Wheat, and the same thing to some extent is rice, the food products are driven, the food security products are driven by population growth. The feed, which is what you see afterwards, the meat, is driven mainly by economic growth, a complete split. And three graphs, that's a future for soybean complex, I mentioned it already. That's what is happening in the live cattle herd changes, and I put the live cattle herd because we have the tendency of self-flagellation in the European Union. We have significantly reduced the number of cattle. What this means is clearly there is a reduction in emissions. Not only that, but most of our cattle is also grazing on grassland, and that's also pretty good for climate action. The Americans are not expected, have not really increased much their herd. Look what happened to Brazil, a very significant increase. Look what happened to Africa. And Africa, very part of it is also buffalo. And what is Africa? This is extensive cattle. So what do you do with it? Of course, you need it. If you want to feed people, that's the best way to do it. What I find very interesting in this graph is that if you take Brazil alone, it has more cattle than the EU, US, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Okay, now, beef trade expectations, I'm not taking the past. Essentially, Brazil exports more, China and the rest of Asia import more. The EU, the US a very minor role. The US is actually, most people tend to forget that it's at the borderline of being a net importer in terms of quantities, which is this. It's a net exporter in terms of value because of the different meats are being traded. Pork is more diverse, and pork is the area where the Americans still expect us to do better than they do. With China, despite its recovery from the diseases they had, still needing to import, and the rest of Asia, not much. Africa doesn't play at all a role in pork. And when it comes to poultry, this is a story for the US and essentially Brazil, feeding and increasing demand mainly to the rest of Asia and some to Africa. So what do I get out of it? And to finish my presentation, these are very tentative conclusions that you've seen in the past, some of you at least. The first one is clearly we need to feed more people with less inputs. That's a no-brainer. I don't understand why we still have to ask question, and you say that we have to do more with less, and people roll their eyes backwards. Second, there is no, and there should be no dilemma, do we need to prioritize climate action or food security? We have to prioritize both at the same time. And how do you do it? And that's what we have forgotten some of the lessons from the past. Because how did we do it in the past? We did it with productivity growth that generated economic and social benefits at the detriment of the environment. Can we do it with productivity growth that would generate economic and social benefits without hurting the environment? For an economist like I am, this is typically asking yourself the question, how do you shift the supply curve to the right? By reducing your marginal cost of production. But can you do it with less environmental footprint? Well, there are plenty of best practices out there that demonstrate that this can be done. And instead of putting our priorities on adaptation to climate change, that would lead to mitigation as well, we have put the cart in front of the horses and we debate about what will happen with the scenario about 2040, 2050 or what have you, while what will tell you how you can improve things is already there. And in my very strong personal view, and that I've said even when I was inside the Commission, the focus that we should have had should have been on prioritizing soil, land. We have put in the Farm to Fork strategy and before that in the CAP proposal very clearly 4 words: soil, air, water and biodiversity. Now, the paradox is that we have 3 directives, or 4 actually, because we have directives on air, water and biodiversity, and we don't have anything on soil. But on soil, we do have a policy whose leverage is on land payments and land management conditions. And if you do good things on soil for all the area that you cover with your policy, you're going to do very good things for water, for air and biodiversity. And you're going to have a multiplier effect. If you generate some sort of nature's zoo on biodiversity, on water, or on whatever you want, and you ignore the intensity and the pressure on the rest of the land, you risk losing on all the fronts. And it's clear that this is not the debate that we have had and we're having, but in my view this is clearly where we need to put our biggest focus. There is an initiative on soil right now. It takes time to turn it into anything more concrete, but the best way to turn it into something concrete is actually to get in the public discussion the very beneficial impacts we have with many practices. The Joint Research Center did a full literature review with more than 200 different practices and what to do in different soil conditions. So, first, we have to focus on productivity. Second, we have to remind ourselves how do we manage to do it. And we manage to do it by reliance on science. And there is no escape from this. And third, we have to remind ourselves that we need it and we still need trade in the future. Now let me be very clear. Productivity is not productivism. And it's not perfect. There is no such thing as perfect in life. But productivity is a simple output to input relationship. So if you put better insulation in your house to save energy, this is a productivity increase that nobody contests. So why in the world do we contest productivity when we discuss it about what we do in the soil or with farm practices? Second, science is not perfect. It's not the absolute truth. We have ideologies and religions monopolizing this debate. But science is the provision of truth in relative terms, with a confidence interval, with a margin of error. How can we reduce this margin of error relying on certain solid methodologies that we have? this is an issue that, in my view, in agriculture is very clearly demonstrated by the very, let me be diplomatic because you're filming that, the very paradoxical attitude we have when it comes to human health, animal health, and plant health. The same technology, the same methodology, and biotechnology is expected to have very different impacts in one or the other. And where we lost this debate is not on agricultural biotechnology, because being in the US when the debate started, I can fully understand why in Europe we were much more hesitant in accepting a new technology when we were just coming, we were in the midst of the mad cow disease. I don't understand today the debate we're having, because we have seen with the debate on vaccination with COVID what biotechnology can do. And in fact, we're talking about traditional, not the new genome techniques. But where is the problem there? It's something that we have to address very seriously in Europe, because we have a problem with perceptions about science. And if we don't give the battle on things that should be common sense, like the vaccination of children, then how do we expect to win battles on things that are more complex, like what happens with plant science? Third point on trade. I'm a trade economist by training. The first thing you learn in trade is that it increases the overall welfare. But you never learn trade is win-win. This is for the political debate of politicians. You learn that you need to have mechanisms whereby winners compensate losers. And if we forget this when it comes to trade, we're always going to have very justified reactions by the losers that want to see a transition into a new situation where they find themselves. And that is not only with trade, it's with employment. We have it with the digitalization debate, and we have it a lot in services. We moved huge masses of population from manual labor to services. Now there is a part of them that is going to robots, so they're asking what to do. So again, three questions that I have asked in my latest piece: who is afraid of productivity, who is afraid of science, and who is afraid of trade? But the answer, you might get it in some future articles. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that really inspiring talk. So we'll go through all the presentations and then we'll have the Q&A later so that we have more time. So thank you very much, Tassos. I will now invite Max Schulman to the floor, to the seat, to provide his perspective as a Finnish farmer, what he sees, and so in the northern kind of hemisphere of Europe. What you see on the ground in your farm and with your colleagues are the challenges, but also perhaps the opportunities for future farming. The other one.
It has to be this one.
No,
That's sorry. Now it works. I've not been sitting here for a while, so you can see it's already difficult just to push the button. That's it. Now, you heard my name, Max Schulman. I'm a farmer, arable farmer from southern part of Finland. And I think it's going to be quite easy to continue from where Tassos actually left us, what he already brought up here. And I mean, I'm trying to bring you in a little bit into how a farmer thinks. Because as you know, a farmer usually looks at the world, looks at the business through his own farm in the first place. That's something for you always to remember. The farmer usually always comes back and he has his ideas, he bases his theories and all of these in first hand on what he experiences in his own farm, in his own region, and then from then on he broadens it out. So that's the first thing. And for sure, once you then start to look at the big picture, like we will do here today, I will look at a big picture from a Nordic farmer's perspective, keeping in mind that I'm coming from Finland. We have more Northern European countries. We can say that they go all the way down to Germany, Poland, the whole Baltics. You have there Denmark, Sweden, etc. You could say that these here, part even of Holland, you would still put in there to the northern side. And we all still have our own challenges when it comes into be able to make sure that we will keep our soils in shape so that we can grow more profitable crops, but also we cope with different ways, on risks, if it is the weather risk, if it is then the risk that comes in from the market, or then the big political risk that we see coming up more and more today, where we have very few tools more than sit down and discuss with the legislators, and also then once it goes forward from the Brussels bubble or from the village here all the way back to our own member states, down to our own region as well. So we are also coping with these together as a farmer. But what I will do here now today, I will bring up a little bit of the challenges that I see straight down on the ground when it comes into plants. I'm an arable farmer today, used to have beef cattle, but already here mentioned the mad cow disease, and on top of that foot and mouth disease. Here in Europe, the outbreak when it happened, I decided 2001 that that's it, so the beef sector can just now be gone for me. I had around 350, 400 heads at that stage. I should have been up to 700-800 heads to be able to be big enough so that you would say that there is really any economics in it, and also to make sure that you all really would be able to get into a production that would actually be profitable. Because in the first hand, what we need as farmers in the future as well, we need to make sure that whatever we do, there is the economics behind it. I know that we always talk about the 3 points of sustainability, and I know here in the village, usually it's always the environmental sustainability that pops up first, second and third usually even, but let's say first, and then on top of that, the second one usually is still on the social side, and the third one usually comes then into discussion is the economical sustainability. And to be able to make sure that we will get the environmental sustainability in place, and at the same time be able to make sure that we do have production high enough so that we can offset these kind of a big political challenges that we have seen now happening, for instance, in Ukraine. If we see that, and as we more or less already today can say, that there will be for a long time from today, there will be less production coming out of that region. That means that the world trade on cereals, as we have just seen the numbers, what Tassos put up there, we will have more mouths to feed. So that we can really take care of this, we need to be economically viable on the farm level so that we can do investments in also to the environmental sustainability. If we do not have that in place, from the beginning, it's very difficult to be able to cope with what's going on. We all know that we need to have more food. Like we have said, we need to be able to produce more, and I would not say with less, I would say more with what we have today. We know that there will be less and less fields available, less and less production facilities available, because we always have infrastructure that takes up some. We also know that there are quite a lot of pressure coming from the environment. We see that the climate change is also changing some regions to become very tough to farm, etc. So we know that if we can at least keep the same as we have today, but be able to increase our production, that would be something that the society and also me as a farmer would like to do. So what do we have there? What kind of tools do we have there? The first thing was mentioned by Tassos, is the soil, our fields. That's our production unit. That's the first one to keep in shape. Do we need a policy to it? I'm not too sure about that. I think that is one thing that if you are a smart farmer, and now we have to make sure and we have to assume that most of the farmers would like to stay in business, he should from the beginning already start to understand that he has to invest in the soils, in his fields, not only make sure that it is in the production way the best one, but also so that it can cope with the big changes that are occurring today from the weather point of view, like we have seen. I mean, one year it might be a humongous drought, the next year you might have excess of water, that's for sure. So you have to prepare the fields so that they can cope with this. Second thing is also you have to make sure that the soil is in such a shape that you can actually plant there any crop that works in your region. You do not have to go in then and think about which field you will do it because of the soil condition, etc. No, you know that the soils are more or less at the same level, you have your pH in place, etc. Then it comes to the next question, what to farm there? What kind of a crop? And now we come into a big thing, and that means that we need to get better varieties. Not only do they have to be able to produce more, they also have to be able to cope with all the different weather events that we have today. Everything from droughts to severe winters when we talk about winter cereals, into heavy rains. We also need them to make sure that they can give the yield, hopefully higher yield today, what we have today, tomorrow. We have a stagnation in the European side. We have had it for quite a few years, and now I really hope as a farmer inside the European Union that we would see this lock being somehow opened. We need to make sure that our plant breeding sector will be able to work hard with the best possible tools available in the future so that we would be able to cope with this. We also know that we have to move away a little bit from, let's say, the crops that we are used to grow, whatever that means, because we are used to grow a lot of crops in Europe. I do not see that we have a big problem with big areas where you would say that you have only one crop being grown. Monoculture in Europe is not that common at all. We do see it, yes, because some industry that are using, for instance, the wheat, the milling industry, corn for the feed industry and all these, you have made investments again from the industry side in a region, and for sure they need to get their raw material from as close as possible. We all as farmers know it's no use to put the grain on wheels and drive it 500 kilometers to the next place. I mean, yes, grain travels well. Usually it doesn't complain too much if it doesn't get wet, but for us it's a cost. So for sure you try to be as efficient as possible. And this is a thing that has been going on for the last 50, 60, 70, 80, hundreds of years. You try to grow as close as possible. And now suddenly you start to change this. You go in and say that no, monoculture, even if we don't have it, you have to plant 3, 4, 5, 6 crops. The politicians are inventing the wheel again. They are inventing crop rotation that we have been always using on our soils. According to the demand from the market, according to how your soils fits in there, your microclimate, and also what the market demands more and more at that stage. So we have to have these kind of possibilities to do. So what I'm trying to say here is that you cannot go and actually ring fence too much what a farmer can do and cannot do on his own holding, to be able to make sure that he will be able to keep his soils, but also through the crop rotation also keep down the use of plant protection products. As what we know today, there is a huge debate going on. We have to cut on the plant protection products. We have said that for the farming side, absolutely, give us the alternatives, because still we will need to have plant protection to be able to make sure that the crops that we plant will mature so that we can harvest them both quantity-wise and quality-wise. So now you come into the other dilemma is also the quality. We have to make sure that through plant breeding we will also be able to get crops that can withstand even after that they are ready. Harvest is being delayed, they still have to maintain the quality. And this is a thing also that can be done partly by plant protection for sure, making sure that the crops do not have too much disease, etc. But the plant breeding comes in here one more time as a tool that should be used. So what we need strong crops that can produce both quantity and quality. And the quality aspect is something that is very, very often forgotten in the debate when we talk about policies, when we talk about less plant protection, less fertilizer, etc. fertilizer is the food for the crop. We all know if you don't get enough food, at some stage you start also to not feel too good, you don't withstand that easy disease, etc. Same for the crops. We also have to make sure that in the future there will be a possibility to use inputs to grow our crops. It can either be mineral fertilizers as we know today, or even better adapt there also from side products, circular economy, bring in there all the possible nutrients that we can also get from the circular economy side, as long as they are clean. As long as we can make sure that they do not go in one more time and destroy the soil, the field. That is our production unit. Here also we, together with the next step, with the buyers of the cereals, beans or peas, protein crops are very high in demand today, that we will be able to use such types of inputs that they can then again guarantee to the next step that this has been grown in this way. So we are all the time following up. We do have their certification schemes in place and we are working more and more on them. But they also have to make sure that these certification schemes will also help the farmer himself, not only the next step in the chain, so that we also will be able to get maybe a little bit better price so that we again can go in and do the next investment to become more green or let's say more economically sustainable to go forward. So the farming sector is not such a simple thing. I mean, it is not so that you have one size fits all. That does not work. We have seen that now during the CAP discussions here. You have your own member state CAP plan. There is not one that is similar to the other. We are back to a quite an interesting way. Yes, it's good to be able to take care that there are certain specific things taken in account on the member state level, but that means that we will have a big mess when it comes down to an open single market. And these are things that we hope that in the future can be avoided. We would also like from the farmers' side to see that there would be a little bit more research done before some of these policies are put in place. I know it is difficult. We are farming under a big roof. You cannot take in consideration all the different things what the weather might throw at you, but you know quite well already today with the information that exists, 5-year, 10-year, 15-year, 20-year averages. We know how the plants have been evolving. We know how much more yield can be done. We also know how much fertilizers can be fit, how much can be given. We do have there already constraints coming in from different directives, nitrate directive, etc. So we know you quite well what we are looking at. From there should be able to be a little bit more information that the policies can then be based on. Because sometimes it feels from the farmer's side that we as the specialists, we as the real specialists in farming, we are being taught by the politicians how to do things. And usually that usually never ends up well. And this is how we fare now that we have seen already today that the CAP, as we know, has worked until now very well, is coming to its end. Too much bureaucracy, too much to follow up, and too much things are given to us from the side. You have to take care of this, this and this. And once we go and tell, for instance, on IPM, Integrated Pest Management, we say, guys, it's good that you are giving it a name, but as a secret we have been using it always. We always go out and look what we do in the fields. But if you go in there and you take away tools from our toolbox, you are destroying it yourself, this IPM. You take away the tools. So quite soon it's for me no use to go and look at it. Either I won't plant that crop that I know that will be eaten by pests, by some weevils. I will not plant it at all. That's one thing. The second thing is I will just pick the one plant protection product that I have in my toolbox and go and use it. That's the other possibility. So we need to make sure that we have there a broad enough toolbox available once these kind of things emerge. If you have, for instance, big infestation of new weevils or whatever larvae, you have to be able to react very fast. And this is the one thing why we have been able to still keep growing in Europe quite securely and safely a lot of crop for the world market and for the European citizens themselves, because we have been able to react and act fast to maintain these. And this is what we need in the future also to be able to do. So the one thing that I would say here is that the farming up in the north is not much different than the farming in the south either, because we have to take care of the same problems. We might have them in a different way. Droughts are something we also have. We are now in the driest part of the season. We are in the spring. We have -5 during the nights. We have +15 during the days. We have about 18 to 25 meters a second winds. And we have about 20 to 30 centimeters of underground. We already still have the ground frozen. So no water is really coming up. So the ground stays cold. Plants are not growing at all. And the topsoil is getting dry by the minute. And this is a drought that we have started to see more and more. So what we need is, we need new crops that has deeper root systems, stronger root systems, stronger plants in my region to withstand these new types of winters with the heavy, first of all, ice cover on top, and then in the spring with these kind of a dry but cold. So it's a cold, dry time. This is what we need. Usually then during the growing season we do have enough water. That's never a problem. Usually we have to lead the water away from the fields. Whereas again, I know Pedro has a little bit of a different problem. He needs to bring the water to the fields. We also have more and more demand for crops, protein crops mainly. We are also working very heavily on these plant breeders and all of these. Small country, very specific climatological constraints. It takes time. That's why they need tools. So we need to make sure that this works. And then the third thing is, when it comes to make sure that these plants will survive the growing season, we need a toolbox of plant protection products in place that can be picked up from the box immediately, and not so that you have to go through still, even if they are legal to use inside the EU borders, still every single member state like to put their spoon into the soup and make a small, adjustment. No, you have to test for this and that. And then you will sit there and see that they're a very good product, but it's not available for me. But for a neighbor in the other country, yes, they can use it. So it's not only the trade that comes outside the EU that do have these kind of constraints. We have it already built in nicely inside the European Union. So let's hope that whatever goes forward, next policies will take this in consideration, make them more simple, and take in consideration that we really are one region. We are a big single common market that can be strong when it comes into the world trade. We need trade, absolutely, but then we have to make sure that we are strong also in what we can grow, so that we can really compete in the world market. Thank you for this. I hope we will have a lively discussion here still today. And now I believe I leave the word here to Amrit. Thank you.
Thank you, Max, for this very interesting perspective. So I will hand the floor now directly to Pedro Gallardo. We just flew in literally half an hour ago. So thank you so much for coming all the way here. So Spanish farmer from the south of Spain. I will let you introduce yourself. I'll put your slides on.
You have the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Henry, to be here in your assembly about the plans for the future. I would like to make a presentation. Okay. Okay. I'm a farmer from Andalusia, from the south of Spain. I'm president here in Copa Coyeca about cereals, also phytosanitary. Well, I'm going to make a short presentation because Mr. Haniotis said many things about this presentation previously, better even than me, maybe. Yes, I would like to say something to Mr. Haniotis. I'm very agree with you. I remember we meet on the 16th of November 2021 in the Farm Europe think tank. And when I asked you for the common agriculture policy, you told me, Pedro, put attention on the input cost because the next year are going to be very expensive for farmers. So, and this is right. You advance that we are going to be very difficult time in the farming. Well, we have a very input cost and also population is growing, like Mr. Tassos said before. Some countries are going to be richer, we have less arable land, we have the climate change, less water that depend of very much in the south, and also the European Green Deal and the strategies. We have some challenge and opportunities, of course, but we need to feed the population, like Max said before. In the south of Europe, I'm coming from Cadiz. Cadiz is the southern province of Europe, continental Europe, and we have a strong problem of soil and also erosion because we depend on the water. This year, for example, we don't have average rainfall since the 12th of December. So we are going to, maybe we are not going to harvest the cereal this year. The solution, as we said before, the seed, the plant breeding, the CRISPR, and of course we said Iberian is a laboratory for the rest of Europe because we have many pests coming from Africa, coming from South America that affect to us. For example, the Xylella, the Dubrotica, for example, and now we have a Limantria dispar in the corn oak in our national park. Population is going to grow, as we could check before, but the United Nations said their population will stop in 2100, and it's going to growing, but it will it will grow in different places. For example, in Africa, it's going to grow very much in the last period of this century. Meanwhile, Asia could lose population at the end of the century, but we need to feed this population. And how to feed them? Well, we have less and less arable land. This is a presentation of DRU, cooperative from Germany, and we can change, like in the world we have 11% more arable land, but in Europe we have lost 27% arable land. Meanwhile, in the southern countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, especially Brazil, they have increased more than 200% the arable land. And the yields are different, of course, in different parts of the world. We can check, like in North America, the last year, the yields, for example, in the cereal, have increased very much compared to Europe. This is the second, and we have a bigger gap year after year. This is what happened in the wheat yields in the last 200 years ago. We can check, like we have the same yields more or less till the middle of the last century, but we have the fertilization and the better varieties, and now we have a distortion in the last 50 years. We can check, like in Belgium, for example, the average of wheat yields could be 10 tons, 9 tons. Meanwhile, in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, we are talking about 2-3 tons maximum, because we depend on the water. So this is, for example, another statistic I took from Joint Research Center, and you can say, like in Spain, for example, we expect 2 tons. Meanwhile, in wheat, meanwhile in Ireland, in Holland, they expect 9-10 tons. So this is for us is very important, the seed, how to adapt the seed to our soil and also to our weather. Sunflower, the same example, we have half yields than the rest of Europe, and this is the cereal production in Spain in the last 32 years. We can check, like if we have good weather, good rains, we have 27 million tons, but if we don't have water, we don't have rainfall. We have 11 million tons. Spain needs 35 million tons. So we always depend on the market. The market for us is very important. We import special soybean, maize, corn, and wheat, and we transfer in meat that we export meat in Spain. We need technology. This is something that you said before here. Our technology, we have a good technology in the tractor. We have more screen maybe than many cars. We need the technology of the drone, of course, but we need to adapt to this technology. We cannot lose the technology. This is an evolution of the technology, but we need appropriate tools to produce. Farmers can adapt to everything. We can check like Matt Damon could produce potato in March, but he has technology. If we don't have the technology, we cannot produce, and we don't have technology in the last year. In Spain, for example, we have 35% of the corn is BT corn. We represent 95% of the GMO crops in Europe. In Aragon, that is in the northeast, farmers produce around 80 or 70% is a GM crop, but we need more technology. This technology nobody uses in United States. The MON 810, nobody. It's like a telephone that Nokia we used 20 years ago. So we need to advance in the technology, and we need to finally to have the new genetic. For example, we have example in Spain about the production of tomato. We have made our work. We have reduced the water to produce the same ton of tomato. We have reduced the land 52%, less land to produce the same ton, 31% of the water less to produce the same ton, and the energy. But when the Commission said you have to make more with less, okay, what else? What I can do if I don't have more technology? So this is important. This is what happened in Spain. The center of the corn is affected because the corn fall down, and we have problem with the mycotoxin, and this corn can't go to the market. So this is why we need the technology. Of course, we have examples in other southern countries like Romania. Romania had 200,000 hectares of soybean. Actually, because they have to ban the GM crops when they enter in European Union. Actually, they have less than half of the soybean, only because a politician question, because they cannot use, the farmers can't continue using this technology. We have example also, but I will stop in the household feed expenses. In Spain, in 1960, the 55% of the incomes that came from a house was for feeding. Actually, a family only used 15% of the incomes to feed. Maybe will be higher, in the next year. But we have done our work. We are putting very cheap food. Of course, the family can go to holiday or have a car that it was not possible in the 1960s. But now it's possible because we are feeding the world very, very cheap. We need, of course, tools. Max said before, for example, we can lose 50% of the production in the south of Europe. This is a study of the Spanish minister. We can lose the 50% if we don't put any solution of that. This is our map in Spain about the erosion, and you can see like the most 80% of the country could be affected by erosion. Also the island, because we don't have water, like Max said before, and we need water in the farm. This is an example in Andalusia. The below right is in my farm also. You can see like this is a durum wheat crop, and it's total damage. Also happens very much in the olive trees, and this because the erosion that happened. I start at the beginning with the input cost. This is the input cost that ASAJA, my farmer organization, we present this to say the population that with this input it's very difficult to make something else. We can do it, but the technology. Now we have maybe the possibility of the new breeding technology. That is also the only technology that we can see that could make something else. But we have the limitation of the soil. We are going to continue losing substances, and this is very difficult for us. Also, Mr. Haniotis show us many data about some countries, and for me it's a very difficult scenario in the future because Brazil is growing very much, and the alliance between Brazil, Russia and China, they are autonomous in the world, so they can produce the grain, they can produce the protein, and they have the market for them. So it could be very difficult scenario in the future. I'm going to finish because I have a limitation in my time. This is my children. This is in the farm. I used to put all of them, both of them, in the medias because we need to communication. Communication maybe for us is was a very difficult issue. We were in the tractor. We are not in the medias. Somebody made for us. And this was maybe our biggest mistake in the past. So I hope the next generation will learn. And now, before to finish, I would like to dedicate some words to Klaus Hammann. Klaus Hammann was one of the leaders and one of the best biologists in the world. He and ASAJA and many other farmers create the Farmers and Scientists Network. He died this week, and it was a pity that he couldn't be here. So best for Klaus Hammann. Maybe we are here because he started 15 years ago in this network. Thank you very much. I will be here for any question. Anrit, pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro, for your perspective from the south. So now I will invite Benjamin Laga. You're ready? Perfect. So Benjamin Laga is the CEO of Protealys. I will put on your slides and let you...
So my background is I'm not a farmer, I'm not a politician, but I'm a scientist. And then asking a scientist to talk about his pet topic in 10 minutes is always quite challenging. So I'll do my best and do something which is very unusual for scientists, but I try to cut corners here and there. But I hope you can forgive me for that, but you can ask always the details later on.
And you push down to move forward.
Yeah. So in the past I was heading the plant biotech activities of Bayer and later BASF, but now I'm heading a startup company who tries to breed and do a lot of breeding effort to bring protein crops back to Northern Europe. So just as a setting the scene, Europe is 70% dependent on the import of proteins. I set aside the use of grass because humans can't feed directly on grass themselves, but if you look at proteins other than grass, 70% is imported, 95% of that is imported as soybeans. That means that 34 million metric tons of soybeans enter our European harbors every year. If you look at the market and how this is organized at a global level, you can see that most of our soybeans come from South America, but that we are not the dominant player in that market because China is really the most dominant purchaser on the global market to feed, of course, their growing population and especially their growing middle class, because as was already mentioned, meat, where proteins are mainly used for indirectly then, is basically linked to welfare of the population. We all know that our hunger for protein has an impact on the South American ecosystems. We also, like already said before, know that climate change does not stop at a certain border. So whatever happens there to the green lungs of the planet, besides the oceans, which are also the green lungs, but is also affecting indirectly, of course, us, and I think we should be aware of it. But even closer to home, what we often don't realize is that it also has an effect on our own ecosystems, because as a scientist you realize that proteins is nitrogen. Nitrogen is not in starch, nitrogen is in protein. So what we do is we massively import proteins which contain a lot of nitrogen. We use that nitrogen in an inefficient way, not directly as human food but as feed. And that nitrogen ends up in our soils. And this is a map of the nitrogen effluents in rivers around the world. And guess where most of the meat production is occurring? So, Northern Europe is quite saturated with nitrogen. So there's a good case from an ecological point of view to produce more protein crops in Europe. There is a good geopolitical reason to produce more protein crops in Europe. And I always get the question, but it is impossible to be self-sufficient in proteins. And first of all, I don't claim that we have to be self-sufficient in proteins, but I think it would at least be good if we're a bit more self-sufficient in proteins. So let's do the math very quickly. 34 million metric tons is every year imported at 3 tons per hectare, which is the current production in Germany, for example, which is where soybeans are really a new crop. So it's not that farmers really have a lot of expertise and that we have the best varieties already out there. We produce at 3 tons per hectare. That means 11.3 million hectares of land. That means 7% of our acreage in Europe. The global average of pulses in rotation schemes is about 5%. So I don't think this is really an impossible number to achieve. And by the way, we did grow pulses quite a bit before sorry for that, that's a difficult one, the Blair House Agreement. And if we look at productivity right now, actually in productivity per hectare, Europe is producing tons per hectare less than we did 30 years ago. That's simply because farmers don't grow it anymore, they have forgotten their agronomic expertise, and they have shifted the production to marginal lands. Basically, that's the biggest reason why we have a lower input. So that 3 tons per hectare could easily be more if we did a bit of an effort in breeding for the appropriate crops and bring back also the agronomic knowledge to the farmers. And it's also an opportunity. Definitely for Northern Europe, you've seen that this is where we have a lot of issues with nitrogen. If you're living in Belgium and Netherlands, there's not a day that you can't open a newspaper and read about our nitrogen issues. Well, whomever was in the past investing in meat and meat production is nowadays investing in the plant-based food and meat and dairy replacement. So there's a good co-localization opportunity for farmers if we bring protein crops back to Northern Europe to facilitate and source that growing market, which is growing at 14% compound annual growth rate of plant-based alternatives. So rather than seeing it always as a threat, maybe we should embrace it and really give it an opportunity, but then make sure that farmers can make a profit out of it. So the next question I get when I say, okay, it is possible to do it, so then the problem is, yeah, but then we're just going to shift the problem to importing wheat and corn, because the total of the land is 100%, so if you give up 10% to grow something, you have to give up another 10%. Well, and here, that's where we have a problem, because if you look at how we use actually all the proteins, 93%, and I make abstraction of the 20% oil that is in soybean, because it's typically already crushed in half of the 34 million tons that we import, half of it, the oil is already crushed out. The other 50%, the oil is still in there, and by the way, if we keep on losing canola as a product in Europe, we might end up with next to a protein deficit, also with an oil deficit. So that's another good reason to grow, for example, soybeans, because that's also 20% oil. But if you look at what is used, 93% is used as feed and only 7% goes directly into food. And so our farmers, which are growing meat, so they need to feed the animals, they buy their protein overseas, and then we need to grow starch, because that's the other component that you need when you grow animals. Starch crops like corn, like wheat, that respond very well to high mineral fertilizer input, and we add another 250 kilograms of mineral fertilizer to make them grow well. Mineral fertilizer, which is currently under pressure for a good reason. I do also agree that farmers still need it, don't get me wrong, but there's a good reason to try to minimize and to look for alternatives, because it is still 1% of the world energy, so 1% of the CO2 production in the world goes to mineral fertilizer. It creates, it's not the CO2 that is even maybe the biggest problem, it creates nitrous oxide as a byproduct, which is 265 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2. And the price of that is linked to the natural gas price. And guess what happens with the natural gas price in the last years? Because we were dependent on Russia for the import of our fertilizer. And by the way, these crops are towards your soil quite neutral for your carbon levels. If you look at protein crops as an alternatives, and there we see soybeans, but also fava beans or peas, whatever you want to grow, they fix their own nitrogen from the air, so you have your fertilizer basically for free, and they don't make more fertilizer than is needed because of symbiosis with soil bacteria. And that's how you get these nodules on the root that you see there. And these are really powerhouses that break ambient nitrogen, which is a triple bond between two nitrogen atoms, and they convert it into ammonium. It's the same process as happens with the Haber-Bosch process for mineral fertilizer, but you basically do it in a natural way without using any fossil fuels for it. And by the way, these crops actually are regenerative for your soil, so they store carbon in the soil. So if we could get a bit of a protein shift away from using only protein crops for meat and dairy production, but increase the meat and dairy alternatives, there's an opportunity for European agriculture, because meat and dairy, they rely on cheap imported GM with a high carbon footprint shipped across half of the globe. They cause this nitrogen accumulation that I talked about, and we use it with low conversion efficiency, which means that in total you need a high acreage to feed a population if you switch to more meat and dairy alternatives. Then for European farmers it's an opportunity, because for once and for all, and don't get me wrong, I'm not against GM. I've been leading one of the biggest GM developing organizations. But for once it's an opportunity, because here in food we don't use GM, so this industry is looking for local non-GM soybeans, because their customers demand for it, and that gives rise to a premium to the farmer. And it has a low carbon nitrogen footprint, it helps in our soil generation, and it has a higher conversion efficiency. So if we shift a bit away from meat towards more meat and dairy replacement, we save a lot of land, because you also need less wheat and maize, etc. And so I think we can make this protein shift, and we can become more protein independent if we do it hand in hand with a shift towards more alternatives. And that's what I really want to say. We should, rather than seeing it always as a threat to our industry, embrace it as an opportunity for our farmers. It's a really growing market segment, 14% compound annual growth rate. And guess who's looking to supply that all to us? And that's everyone outside of Europe. Canada, for example, is ramping up very quickly non-GM production, because it sees an opportunity and because it's more than happy to deliver non-GM soybeans to us, because we don't grow it ourselves. And then coming to conclusion, I think the farm to fork strategy in all its ambition, I embrace that a lot, but we also have to realize and be fair about it that it will have an impact on European agriculture, and it will decrease the productivity if we don't allow technology as a mitigation action. So if we look at what could be done, I think there are technologies around, that was already said before. We just have to learn how to embrace them. If you look at reducing the inputs, there's the circularity, definitely that can help, and recovery of waste streams for inputs. But there's also the biologicals that we can use it. There's bacteria that make nitrogen available to plants, not only even for legume species who do this naturally, but also in other crops, like even for maize and corn. Biologicals can help to reduce the inputs, also to make phosphor available, because phosphor is abundant in the soils, but it's not always available to plants. There's a lot that we can do in breeding with artificial intelligence that we link to genetics. That's also what we do at Protealys, for example. By the way, we also work on the biologicals to improve productivity. So we can breed better crops, and this is, I think, where I would say that we're still in Europe in the green zone. Then I think if we go towards reducing pesticides, then definitely automation. I've seen the drone image, etc. Automation is definitely something that can help. There's autonomous systems. You see in a lot of parts of the world autonomous tractors driving around already. I think here in Europe it's still a bit of a struggle with legislation to have all these autonomous equipments running in the field. But definitely for post-emergence herbicides, I think one part of the solution is in automated mechanical weeding again, like we did in the old days, but then at an automated level, because we don't have the labor anymore to do it. And then we come to where we are in the red zone, and that's very surprisingly, this is really where Europe has its biggest strength. We have the best plant biotech industry in the globe, and we have also some of the best big seed companies in the world. They're European based, and guess what? They all breed for the American market and much less for the European market. And why is that? Well, there's a very good reason for it. First of all, if you have to invest in these technologies, it's not the research that costs money, it's your development cost, it's your deregulation cost. So you have to find use cases that make sense. If we keep on putting a burden on the use of technology that is costing a few €100 million to put something on the market, well then guess what? It will remain something that is not done by SMEs. It will remain a tool that is in the industry of the big corporations, and the only use case will be herbicide tolerance. I mean, it's as simple as that. It's the only thing that can make the numbers work. Whereas we could do much more with the technology than that. It's just that the high cost avoids us to do anything other than that. Now we can get around GMs in a lot of ways with gene editing, where I still think that eventually the only answer is going to be in GM is to reduce insecticides. And so we have thrown away, like we say in Dutch, the child with the bathwater, by focusing and looking only at herbicide tolerance. If you really look at the impact on environment, the reduction of insecticides by putting basically a protein in a plant that is used also in biological production, being the Bt protein, because there it's allowed to just spray it on your crop, but you can't build it into a crop. Well, it's really silly, but that is the way it is. That can help dramatically with the reduction of insecticides, if we would allow it. And then gene editing is the next child on the block. I think we are all aware that it's currently high on the agenda of the European Commission. I hope they really make a decision before the end of this year and don't tilt it over the election, because God knows what will happen if we do that. But gene editing is a tool where we can help plants to fortify them against fungal attacks. It can help us to make plants more climate resilient. I heard that a couple of times before. That's definitely also something that we need. But also it can have a lot of quality improvement. So like I heard, and I was happy to hear that, we shouldn't only focus on the quantity but also on the quality. And especially if it pertains to land use for direct use in human consumption, there's a lot you can do in terms of health, etc., when we also allow tools like gene editing. So with that, I hope I made a bit of a case of bringing protein crops back to Europe, and hope that you see it as an opportunity and also see that we need to embrace technology more. So in short, I think we need to leverage the protein shift as an alternative, to bring an alternative to farmers, and not to be seen as a threat for the meat industry only, because I'm not claiming that we have to get rid of all the meat, not by far, but I think some level of shift would benefit both the climate and the farmers if we set up a structure that allows them to benefit from it. We should look at farmers and try to treat them as guardians of our ecology and our landscapes, but then also properly reward them for it. And also, with the interest for our farmers, level the competition playing fields for imports that do not adhere to the same ESG standards that we set ourselves in Europe. I very much support these standards, but our farmers need to be able to be competitive. So we need to level that playing field. So how can someone really say that it is okay to import cheap products from deforested regions in Brazil and say this is all fine, and say to the farmers, okay, but you have to adhere to very strict standards? In my opinion, it doesn't make sense. We're exporting our problems to the rest of the world if we keep on doing that. Subsidy schemes should focus on the use of sustainable land first. I think that goes without saying, and technology needs to be embraced. And if I can add one last point from a very selfish point of view, as a breeding company, we should also make sure that breeding companies get rewarded, just like farmers get rewarded, especially in open pollinated crops where there's little protection and where a lot of black seed is on the market, where farmers don't get any royalties. So if we want to have companies focusing on European market, then we should make sure that technology is in there, because what is so interesting about technology, if you sell a trait, there's no cost of goods. If you look at Brazil, for example, soybean, 50% of the value of the seed is in traits. It goes straight into your EBIT. There's no cost of goods. The profit that you make on seed is marginal. So there's a good reason why all of these bigger companies are focusing on North American and South American markets, because they make more money out of the traits than they make out of the seed. So if we don't make sure that companies can make money on their breeding efforts, then there's going to be no effort to create more resilient crops and better crops for the future. I don't know who showed it, but there was a nice graph which showed the gap in productivity that was going up when big companies are focusing on developing better seeds for North America, and where Europe lagged behind. That's just an effect of not having as adequate focus on breeding in Europe, because that focus is missing because of lack of profitability for seed companies. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Benjamin. So I'd like to invite all the speakers back up here, and then we'll have to do a relatively short Q&A because we are running late. But yes, please. Sorry about all the t-shirts. Okay, so I'd like to then open the floor for any questions. Victor?
Thank you for all speakers for very impressive presentation. I really like
Sorry, can you introduce yourself?
I'm Victor Corzon from KWS, a company, breeding company with old history, and I really like to put the soil on the middle. And I like the picture to have, and for me this will be comparison to human body, soil. And them is heart, is seeds or breeding. Them is stomach is could be microbiome. And them, what I put it here in my list, science is brain, and many others. Why I put it this is parallelity, because it's a lot of complexity. Soil is not only soil. It's also living soil. It's not conservation what we are talking on farming fields. We need to keep for next generation, 100 years the soil, and this should be really difficult, taken by EU really seriously. To have a diversity, to have the rotation, to work together on this complexity. This is one point I like to rediscuss again. And Tassos, back reflection to you. Wheat is excellent example of that. We see the stagnation on Europe because we are already on the top of the production, 8 ton, 10 ton, and currently new record of now back to EU is 17.84 tons in UK. This is the maximum or which we could achieve. I mean, we still have potential, and I think we do also on breeding side very good job in Europe, because many years ago I talked with plant physiology with all other top experts on wheat. We believe on wheat, if we have everything, we may achieve 25 tons, probably. Still potential, but on global level, you are fully right, we are talking about less than 2 tons per hectare. And this is very important to think, not only on the European level, but also on global level, to see what is contribution of EU could be for another country, how we could support by transferring of technology, of knowledge to other countries. Very happy to have such discussion, and thank you very much for very impressed presentation.
Would you like to?
Yeah. Okay. No, I think it was good that you brought up this the soil one more time, because I mean people talk about biodiversity. We cannot just forget how diverse the soil is. There is a huge biodiversity inside the soil as well. If you keep it in good shape, you really will see that there is plenty going on there. And this is something that is not really in the discussion either when it comes to it. And then, please, I would like to have this 25 ton per hectare wheat. Tomorrow, if possible, I'm going to plant, I hope it's a spring wheat variety, I'm going to plant in 2 weeks' time, so send the seeds.
If I could immediately reply and say, you mentioned you need to have new crops. This is not new crop, it's old crops you have already in Finland. And crop is hybrid rye. And scientifically, because I spent a lot of time with this crop, if we understood scientifically why rye could survive by -35, why rye could survive drought, why rye could use much efficient as wheat nitrogen, we will win-win have in Europe. And I think you agree with me, because this is traditional crop for Finland as well.
Thank you for the question. I would like to add something. I'm in farming business in last 26 years, but of course my grandfather was a farmer, my father also. We started in the 90s to take care of our soil with a no-tillage, and we started, and during 8 years we made a no-tillage technology. The problem is the rabbit. That is maybe the problem that doesn't happen in Brazil or United States, but we have 2 rabbits per hectare after 8 years of no tillage. So when we put some technology, we have to check what is the opposite, because for me, my potential is not 25 tons. My potential is 5 or 6 tons. Meanwhile, my average is 2 or 3 tons. So we need to access as fast as possible to this technology, because if we don't have this technology, we're losing area, we're losing hectares. This year maybe we are going to harvest half of the cereal in Spain, and maybe we are not to harvest the sunflower, this really planting right now. So with this technology we lose the neonicotinoids on the sunflower. That it was a very good pest manage of the pest, and also was a booster in our sunflower. This technology is only banned in Europe. I don't know any other country in the world where the sunflower using the thiametoxam or the other neonicotinoid is banned. And I don't know if another part of the world had the problem with the bee, but we have banned, and now we continue with the problem of the bees after that. So if we don't have technology in the seed, we are going to continue losing hectares of arable land in my country. That we need the increase. We need to increase the yield very much. So we are leader in the non-tillage in Europe. We have more than 1 million hectares in Spain, but we can't have a very strong, very high yields with the actual technology. So we need to advance if we want to increase the no-tillage area and to create more diversity. Thank you.
Let me try to jump in here. Feeling a bit uncomfortable, the city boy and the economist sitting next to two farmers and a scientist. But I've always stuck my neck out, so I'm still on my shoulders, so let's see. Now, first of all, I like your metaphor with the body, because as a or a social scientist, if you want, I see things from a different perspective. Sometimes this is not necessarily bad. Now, why do I like this? Because when we talk about body, we also talk about the possibility of a disease, a health issue. And we take it for granted that we have overdone it in the use of chemical pharmaceuticals and antibiotics or what have you, but we also take it for granted that we will always need medicine, and we're not going to go to homeopathic treatment for everything. Why the hell don't we do the same thing for plants? That's a question I have been asking for the last 3 or 4 years, even internally when we were in the Commission and in public. Because if we don't address this question openly in the European Union, we will continue doing what you just mentioned. Because when I was in the delegation in Washington, and that's long time ago, 96 to 2000, everywhere I went, in American universities, you go to Davis, that had the best department of biotech, ag biotech, because they had the best department of medical biotech. Who was leading there? A young Irish girl that had just left Europe. You go to the genome project in Iowa State. Who was leading it? A German that had left Europe. And that's exactly what we have done by not asking this basic question. Second thing, because I mentioned medicine. You talk about the manner by which people form their perceptions. And when it comes to the role of meat and livestock and human health, and there have been a recent very good seminar of the Animal Task Force, and there are scientists with the Dublin Declaration that are coming in a more balanced approach. Are we about to face the same thing with the so-called Eat Lancet report that we faced with the Lancet article about a perceived or the supposed autism that a triple vaccination for children generates? It took Lancet 12 years to remove this fraudulent article. And what you have more and more in their so-called Eat Lancet report is very clear indications that in certain areas, not in everything, because everybody knows that we need to eat more fruit and vegetable, but in certain areas they multiplied the risk factor of meat by whatever number you want without them providing any evidence. The damage is already done. And why is this important? Because if we don't have a balanced debate about the pros and cons of what we're doing, we're never going to go anywhere. We will always be polarized about miraculous solutions that will come. And yes, scientists have to find ways of putting the trade-offs as well. And on the other hand, a totally catastrophic situation that does not lead anywhere, because you cannot motivate people by telling them we're going to die anyway, but they say, what the heck do I have to try for anything better? And this is exactly where one of the problems I see with a scientific, not a scientific approach, but a communication that we have so far, is that we have not managed to use in certain areas numbers in a solid way. I'll give you an example. With all due respect to what you said, because I agree with 60 or 70% of what you said. But I'll tell you what I don't agree, because it takes back to my previous times. Soybean yields around the world are 3 tons per hectare, the same thing in Europe.
Yes.
Wheat yields around the world are 3 tons per hectare, Brazil, US, there are 6 in Europe. Mm-hmm. So why in the world don't we do soybeans in Europe? It's not because we cannot do or because of the Blair House Agreement. It has nothing to do. The Blair House Agreement was before the WTO, and since the WTO we have the same rules and a very diverse evolution of what is happening at our production, whether it's cereals, for food, for feed, or the meat sector. It has to do with the price response of our farmers to the market situations they faced. And why do I say that? Because exactly this is the missing element in many of the scientific approaches on what is happening in agriculture. There is such a thing that is price. And it's very, very different. It's not only now with the strategic plans, my dear Max. When we had the same very high support price for cereals in Europe, not everybody faced the same situation, but nobody then said we don't have a common market. Despite the fact that there were member states that were overusing withdrawal of cereals to stocks and others were not. So, I mean, let's face it, in everything we have to face, whether we start from soil or whether we go to the markets and the land markets or any other market, we do have very different opportunity costs for land and opportunity costs for labor in the European Union. And this will necessitate the difference to diversify. And that's why we have to get the numbers right. And here is where I would agree fully with what you say on the proteins. By the way, soybeans are not proteins in many definitions, they're oilseeds. But if we had put as a priority, it has a protein, a very high protein content, but it is classified, especially in the Blair House that you mentioned, as oilseeds together with sunflower and with canola. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, you have the solution on that, however. Because if our focus had been on soil, here is the paradox. We have all the information that we want at a very detailed level from satellite mapping that tells us pretty much where is the focus we have to put on soil management, and that screams for more rotation with protein crops. It screams for it. And instead of focusing on prioritizing things, we prioritized everything. If you open all the fronts, you're going to lose. If you prioritize where you have the leverage, you're going to move further on. And that would have brought exactly what you say, where we need it much more. Because we clearly need to balance much better what happens in the soil. And by the way, when I mentioned that we have leverage, on antibiotics we put these targets are all 50%. I mean, it didn't start with the Green Deal, to be clear. It started with sustainability development goals, where there was a competition how you throw the highest number up in the air. And we have 50% everything. On antibiotics, we're almost there. On nutrient balance, we need to see what it means at a very regional level and with which practices. When it comes to pesticides, we have a target for 2030, and we will have data in 2028. Okay, so you see these differences. And because I've spoken too much, sorry, but what I want to say is that if we narrow down the target we have to something that is more mature, from a point of view of knowledge you have in terms of the basic problems you have to solve. And in soil, we have this detail. In terms of the leverage you have with the policy mechanisms you have, and we have it because we have conditionality and we give payments on the basis of what you're supposed to do in the soil, and we look also at what is happening in the global markets, then some of the things we're discussing here would have been more advanced. Because part of the problem that you say about the proteins and the alternative meats has a lot to do with the fact that we ignore completely, which is what type of feed additives do we need to put to make this taste appropriate. And there is a market out there that will be there. And this market you cannot determine with policies. It's taste and preferences. And taste and preferences are changing, and they're changing in very different ways. And you need to open the possibility to farmers. If people are moving towards vegetarian diets, they should go towards vegetarian diets, knowing exactly where the prospects are. But at the same time, especially in Europe, and that's a big difference with other parts of the world, 40% of land is permanent grassland. Do we want to touch it? If we do, we better go out and say it openly, but be able also to estimate, both at the level of the EU and at the global level, what the impact is going to be. Because we're not perfect, obviously, but we're doing many things much better than the rest of the world. And we have managed not to give credit to the most sophisticated system, food system that exists in the world, and to an agriculture which is the only one from the major agricultures that has reduced emissions globally. Does this mean that we've done what we're supposed to do? No. And I have been saying from the beginning, this is not the case. But if we managed to do something that others didn't manage to do, there must be something that has worked. Let's go and find it so that we can improve it further.
But just as a short reaction to that, I also agree with 60% of what you're saying. But I think we should be careful, and again, I'm also eating meat. Let me be clear about that. But what we're creating is, if we look at, I say it's economics, and yes, but if you look at what we're producing, it's to a large extent also for export. And the question for me is, should Europe become the dung heap of the world because of the way we do agriculture? Because by overproducing and exporting meat, we create problems for our own environment that we cannot export. And that's also something I think to take into consideration.
Yeah, but let me clarify where I agree fully with you. That's why you have to look at the impact of what you do concretely. Because there are parts, if for example we use soil as a starting point, there are parts of Europe that there is so much nitrogen in the soil that you ask yourself, why the hell do we do it? And then you cut down. But you don't go with an overall approach that says everywhere you do that. Because there are areas in Europe where you can even use more nitrogen because you have a deficit instead of a surplus.
Yeah. One thing, Tassos, I was just going to bring in, I mean, Europe, we do grow in smaller amounts. I've been all the time growing protein crops. Mainly that has gone through your own animals out into the market and all this. We have not really had a big business out of it, I mean, in the way that you would have had an industrial interest in European proteins. There was at some stage, but in the last 30-40 years, there has not been investment done in it. Now they start to invest again. And one thing what we have there is that we are small units in Europe. It has been quite more difficult for them to collect the bigger amounts of protein crops, if it is beans or peas or soy, whatever for their use. It has been much easier to pick up the phone and order a big vessel from the regions where they actually also, the protein crops, can compete better with the cereals. Like you just mentioned, I mean, we have double the yields, average yields here on wheat and barley, for instance, rye as a good example, even higher in some ways, than to our protein crops. And for the farmers, there are two other things. One, protein crops or legumes in general, they are more difficult to grow. There is a higher risk. The price discovery for that is not good at all in Europe. Usually it's tied down to soy, coming over the price discovery from North America usually. We would need here to make sure that we have here a good market. We would need price discovery and pricing points in every single member state. Like if you go to the US, you have a lot of pricing points and delivery points when it comes to both wheat, soybeans, corn in the major growing areas. So you can actually price your crop. You can price everything you grow and sell at the spot. Europe, this is very difficult. Small units, Euronext main place is down in the central part of Europe. You don't really have any price discovery elsewhere where you would actually be able to grow more of these protein crops. So we have here a thing that we have to solve together with the chain. It's not only the farmers, it's not only the politicians that need to look into this, it is also the whole chain. And that's why we need there also investments from the industry side. We also need them to make sure that there is a market for the produce what they will produce as well. And this is what's ongoing today. We see that there is a bigger interest in growing these crops. And we also see that the plant breeders are putting more effort into it. There are coming more and more new varieties out. And then for sure we have one thing when it comes to soy. I mean, it is a crop that needs a little bit darker night, so to have some good soy up in Finland inside the next 10 years I think will be a challenge, but maybe in the next 20 years you will be able to do it. And the second thing is they do not really like these kind of a cold kiss that might occur still in June, July, all the way up there. But then you have your beans, the fava beans, then you have your peas. So we also have to base our proteins on the crops that can be grown in the region and not only look into one crop.
One short comment, because in Spain we don't have soybean. We have only 1,500 hectares only in Spain. But then sure, if we have GM soybean, we will have much more hectares of soybean. But the problem is that we don't have this technology, because this is one of the best rotation, but it cleans our field of weeds. But without this technology, happened the same in Romania, that they decrease the area. Only in Europe, Italy has 200,000 hectares, 1 million tons, more or less, in soybean, because they have an internal market and they have made great internal market. But for us, it's very difficult without this technology. I'm sure it will grow much more in Spain, but with the right technology.
Thank you. So we are running a bit late. So is there any last question? Otherwise, I'll just ask for a brief statement from all the speakers, and then we'll go for a very short coffee break. But no. Is it going to be short?
Yes.
Very short, please.
To all speakers, the question: we make prediction for the future. Would make sense to look much more back, because history of agriculture in Europe and worldwide is not 50 years, it's not 100, it's much more. And we have such fluctuation always, shifting one crops to another. Would make sense to more deeply to look back and use the knowledge back again for resilient agriculture for the future. Short answer, please.
Yeah, so maybe if you can each answer
Yeah.
and then wrap up to...
Exactly.
Right.
Yes,
Thank you.
my answer is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that in what happened in the past there are always lessons, but no in the sense that we need to be aware of the fact that we have a much more accelerated change in every aspect of what we're living. And that's why it is much more important to make scenarios about what will happen in the future. We're not able to predict the future, but we're able to identify 2 or 3 main scenarios around which we should place our actions. And that's where I think, for example, one of the biggest issues that we have to address, which is pretty much linked at least with the debate we had and some discussion at least for wheat, is what is the role of Ukraine going to be in a future construction of the European Union? Because it is one thing to have what Ukraine produces as coming inside the current Union, and it's a completely different thing to facilitate the role of Ukraine in what they used to do in the past, which is export to the rest of the world. No.
I always like to bring in, you say that we have to look a little bit into the past as well, and I always bring it into my farmers and to myself as well, that when you drive the car, the windscreen is the big thing that you look forward to, but you have there the small, rear view mirror that is very good once in a while to look back. And I think we have to look back a little bit to see how did we survive in the 50s, 60s, even 70s, before we started to see that we also started from the world market to get a bigger amount of soy coming in at that stage from the USA, North Americas. We were able to survive at that stage. And we should look back, why did we survive? Not what did we, for sure, what did we grow, how much, but also what was the difference? Did we eat, for instance, the discussion here, meat every day? Did we eat something else? Did we have something else on our plates? And I think that everybody here can more or less look at and remember what was served at home during that time, 60s, 70s. It was not the steak every day. It was not either white meat every day. So we had a little bit of a different way how we did eat. So that has one factor. So that's good to look back and see. Same thing to look back, what did we grow at that stage and for what purpose? So yes, you should, but the main focus still has to be forward. And I think that if we lose that and only look back and think, oh, things were much better at that stage, then we will lose. No, we have to be able to look forward, use all the knowledge, know-how, bring in the technology, also make sure that we do not have more of our brains moving out from here. Let's keep the business in Europe. Let's work together and make one more time this region and area actually self-sufficient quite far. I don't say 100%, I agree on that. 70%, fine. Risk is too high. If you go for 100%, then you have to have 120% at least. And then you are again competing in the world market in a different way. But let's aim to that.
Pedro and Benjamin, would you like to say some closing remarks?
If I still need to pick up on that topic as a closing remark, I think when I grew up as a child and I looked at the fields, we couldn't grow maize either at that point in time. So I think when Europe, with its soils and its climatic condition, puts its effort in breeding to it, we can pretty much do quite a lot, even with new crops, if we wanna grow something else. And the other thing, as a conclusion and also a bit backward looking, is we really need to be careful not to make the same mistakes with technology once again. I think, and we should also be retrospectively into that as scientists ourselves, because we didn't do a good job, and as an industry also we didn't do the best job in making sure that we got the attention and the buy-in from the consumers, because there was no consumer benefit in it, and because scientists are typically not the best communicators. I think that's a mistake that we should recognize that we made from the past when trying to get technology into Europe, and I hope we don't repeat that same mistake and lose another opportunity to really help out, but do it for the better and make sure that not only the big corporations can make money out of it, but also the farmers, also the consumers see the benefit, and it adds to the health of our soils and our planet.
Thank you. I would like to continue the Max Schulman message and also Professor message. We have to learn from the past. I remember that my grandfather grew livestock in Spain in the 60s because our government give you money to produce meat, to produce protein, because we don't have protein in Spain. In the 50s, in the 60s and the 70s, we don't have enough protein. People feed because of soup and flour of cereal, especially from wheat. But now the consumer want to have different production. We are producing now pitaya in Spain. That is something that I never hear before. We are producing quinoa in Spain. That is very difficult crop for us. But we have to learn from the past. In the 80s, people died in Ethiopia because there is no food for feeding. And the singers, Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, the Boss, everybody have to record that We Are the World, special to take money for these people. So if we don't learn, it will happen again, because at the end it's an economy, and if Africa doesn't produce enough, Europe has to be solidarity with Africa, and this is what our politicians never understand. They have a very short mind. We want to produce. We are producing our farm in generation, and we want to continue producing, not for only for us, because we have to produce for the rest of the world.
Thank you. Very inspirational to finish on that topic. So I'd like to thank all the speakers and everyone here for joining us today. A very inspirational discussion.